Timeout. Hey, there we go. That's kind of a nifty feature. I can actually flip my screen around. You can see the test rig that I'm working with, which is an old air cleaner nailed to a brick wall with my sticky thing. What is happening, everybody? Everybody's having a fantastic start to their week. Let everybody kind of get in on the chat. Got kind of a fun one for you. For any of you guys that have ever wondered what is the difference between net horsepower versus gross horsepower, this will be really cool for any of you guys that are into old school muscle cars. Anything that you guys have ever heard about with the Hemis, with the 350s, with the 396s, and the 351s and all that kind of stuff. This is going to be for you guys, you old school guys that always want to tell us how much faster the cars were back in the day. Okay, fine, whatever, Gramps. But here's the thing. The power numbers is really what we're looking at. And I get that there was a lot of misconceptions. There was a lot of legend behind the legends. And that's one of the issues that I want to talk about is you're always yammering on about legends like Chevelles again and the Boss cars and this car and that car. But in reality, those cars were pretty much right on the money when it comes to ratings. Now, there were some that were a little bit low, a little bit high here or there, but for the most part, especially for the cars that I've tested over the years, they've all been fairly close. So what does all of this stuff mean? I'm going to say what's up to everybody real quick, and then we'll start getting into this, because I think this is going to be a fun one. This is one I've actually wanted to do for a while, so I'm kind of amped up about it. Mainly because there's a lot of misconceptions about gross horsepower versus net horsepower. So checking in with everybody real quick. Y'all guys checking in saying, what up, my man? He's first in. What's up, V? Michael Coliano saying, even Professor Mason got the arm flex. I like it. Ryan McKinsey saying, what up, B? What's up, Ryan? Brother Casey is saying the arm flex. I like it. Check in. Mark saying, time for a good old Professor Mason live stream. I like it. Slash is saying, yup. Sup? Yup. What the fuck? Clutch saying opinions on no lift shifting on the 6-speed TR6060 on the 392. I say go for it, but you need to do the clutch line mod before that's actually going to work right for you. You've got a this little good. I've done a video on it, but I didn't do a how-to. If you Google clutch line mod Challenger, it should pop up. You need to remove this little restrictor that's in there. And it'll make wide open throttle shifts a lot easier. Jonathan's saying, what's going on, B? Looking forward to the show. Was watching a video of the dyno at Pikes Performance. Very interesting. What that Mustang dyno can do. It's really cool what that thing can do. I'm sure it gives him an edge road tuning the cars. Absolutely. In fact, one of the cool things about that dyno is that so when you put a Hellcat variant, doesn't matter which one, Demon, Red Eye, Hellcat, it doesn't matter. When you put one of those cars on that dyno and you load test it, what load testing is you're actually braking the engine, or you've got a brake on the wheels that is limiting the engine, I should say, to a given RPM. So let's say you want to load that thing at, say, 4,000 RPM or 3,500 RPM. You tell the dyno, just don't let this thing go over 3,500 RPM. And as you apply throttle, the dyno will apply load, and it will not let it get over that RPM, whatever that RPM is designated to be. And there is nothing spookier sounding than a 6.2 liter at full song at 3,200 RPM deadheaded. It's kind of scary sounding. But anyway, that's one of the things you can do. It's literally as though the car is dragging itself. Like it's even more of a load than if the car was pulling itself straight up into the air. And you just go, yeah, and it just starts to wail, and then you just roll out of it. But it's pretty cool stuff. I love that thing. David Townsend's got the horns. I like it. Brent saying, what up, guys? Mark saying, still getting accustomed to my RT. I color at Frost Hobby because of her frostbite blue color. It's a pretty color. Going to continue to break her in for a while until you get to the fight, until you start doing the build. Very nice. Brent said about 5 years from now, we've been talking about an EV Dodge Charger. Maybe it'd be kind of a cool thing to have the Dodge Charger as an EV. I mean, it kind of goes together, kind of a play on words. 62's asking, catless or gut the factory cats, and do catless mids actually make horsepower, being these cars are tuned good from the factory? So 62, I'll tell you what, it depends on your power level, but if you're running stock boost or maybe a 285 up or 295 up or something like that, at the drag strip, we have pulled the cats and the cars didn't get any faster. It can be actually argued that the cars lost a little bit by pulling the cats. I know that sounds weird, but the ET didn't improve and in fact was down by a couple of hundreds. We're talking a variance, so don't take this as it lost power. It just didn't gain any power by pulling the cats off the car. And two of the cars actually got like not significantly slower, but were down by about 300 or 400. And mile an hour was down subsequently. The cats went back on the car and the cars picked up the mile an hour. So I don't like removing catalytic converters on these things. I'm running low 10s with the cats on the car. We've had the Demons, Ray's Demon. We set the record at 978 in as delivered fashion. That car had the factory, it's as delivered, had the factory catalytic converters on it. And everything in between. I know that got a buddy of mine, I can't remember his handle on Hellcat.org or whatever it is, but his car is a 985. It's gone 970s on 93 octane with a little bit of butane, and it's got factory cats. So there's that. It tuned cars, obviously. But if you're planning on pulling the cats, which way to go? Don't gut the factory cats. You might need them someday. So if you are absolutely set on removing the catalytic converters, just get the cat delete pipes. They're a hell of a lot cheaper than a new set of catalytic converters. You can always sell them. If you get rid of the car, you can put the cat pipes back on and sell your catless, and you're good to go from there. That's what I would do. In fact, that's what I did with my SRT. When we wrapped up all the testing, all the exhaust testing on the 392s, just, sold them. Doc Diff Sim saying, what up, B? What up, Doc? 60 Empire saying, thanks in advance. Got the arm flex, you got it. Brother K saying, what do you think about adjusting the negative camber on the rear wheels for a daily driver 5.7? You could maybe get away with, half a degree less camber. It'd be fine. I mean, you can definitely, for one, it's a good idea just to do it to check your alignment, but you could probably get away with pulling a little bit out of the negative camber out of that suspension setup in the rear. The cars have got a lot of negative camber, by the way, surprisingly a large amount. But yeah, I mean, I would adjust it out. I wouldn't adjust it more in. That's going to kill traction and actually make handling worse, depending on how deep you go in with those wheels. But if you wanted to bring them up a little bit, make them a little bit more parallel so that they hook a little bit better, that's probably a good idea. Dr. Diff saying, cats get a bad rap for past problems. They pretty much have them figured out, not to mention gutting cats makes an open chamber for uneven airflow. Very true. Dr. Div saying, so checking out how's the net versus gross thing work. So let's get into that. So that's kind of the whole deal that we're getting into. So tonight we're going to be talking about this. Hopefully you'll have to hit pause. There we go. You'll have to hit pause and save it, do a screenshot of that. And that'll give you our study material for the evening. So what are we talking about? We're talking about net horsepower versus gross horsepower. And this is coming straight out of the 1971 Dodge Barracuda, or Plymouth, I should say, Barracuda / Cuda lineup. And to give you some quick history, and this is, by the way, this is where I go into like a second monologue, and this is probably going to go on for a bit. So if I don't get to you, I'm sorry if I don't get to you, but this is kind of a fun topic that I've been wanting to do. So there you have it. So in 1971 was kind of a turning point in terms of how engines were going to be rated. Anytime after 1971, so 1972 on, all of the horsepower ratings were in net horsepower. And there are several different net horsepower ratings, but suffice it to say that the long story short here is that the horsepower numbers, the advertised numbers, went down, regardless of the fact that the engines didn't change one bit, but the power numbers went down. And the barometer that a lot of people will use will be the 300 horse 350s, where that 300 Chevy 350, where the Chevy 350 that was previously rated at 300 horsepower was now rated at 250 horsepower net. But what does net mean and what does gross mean? Well, there's actually an SAE standard for gross horsepower. Actually, there were several, but the way it broke down was this. The engine was put on an engine stand, obviously no transmission behind it, and hooked to a dyno. And again, we're talking about gross horsepower here. That engine would not have a front engine accessory drive, aka FEADs. It would not have an air cleaner assembly. It would not have any parasitic, in many cases, it won't have any parasitic loss associated with the rotating assembly. We're talking alternator or generator. We're talking water pump, power steering pump, any other pumps or any other things that would be attached to the front of the engine, as well as they would use and were allowed to use long tube headers and a collector as a test pipe. Now, by today's standard, we would look at that and go, that kind of sounds like cheating, right? But the mentality behind gross horsepower is that that was a theoretical maximum that engine could make. And that would be, I guess the reasoning, if you will, behind all of that was, this is the power potential of this engine. Because the guess was that engine could potentially go into anything, realistically. But that's how they rated it, because they, being the engine manufacturer, wouldn't be able to account necessarily for what other front engine accessory drives, there could be other accessories, fans and other things, cooling needs. If you've got an engine that could potentially be put in all these different platforms, like a truck or a big truck or a car or whatever, they're all going to have different parasitic losses. And so the idea was to give a designation for an engine. In other words, this is the 150 horsepower 6-cylinder, but that 150 horsepower may only really be in the truck. For example, it could be 110, and in a car it could be 125. So that'll give you a reason behind why you would have gross horsepower. It's simply just a mentality. It's a way of looking at a power unit, which in essence, that's kind of what they were doing. Kind of an archaic way of looking at it, but think of it like this. If you could just, if you go to Harbor Freight and you buy an engine for a lawnmower, that engine is rated at, say, 20 horsepower. But if you were to put that engine in a motor vehicle that had an air conditioner and a water pump and all this other stuff that it ran, obviously the performance wouldn't be of a 20 horsepower power plant. It would be considerably less because of the parasitic loss. That's the mentality. It's just a power unit. Well, a lot of folks started getting wise to the fact that it was pretty easy to manipulate those numbers. So in 1971, a lot of the manufacturers were rating engines both in net and gross horsepower. The reason why that's important is because today's figures are all in net horsepower. So what does net horsepower mean? Well, for what we're going to be talking about today, net horsepower means front engine accessory drive, FEAD, is attached to the engine, and it's all possible configurations of your FEAD. In other words, if your car could be optioned with an air conditioner, then the air conditioner is attached to that block. Whether it's engaged or not is irrelevant. Engagement is not the question. It's the fact that it has to turn that clutch or anything like that. Okay, so you have that, the water pump, the alternator, power steering pump. Basically everything, a fan also, which is another key thing because fans have a significant draw on power if they are hard mounted and not on a clutch, a fan clutch. So all of those components are attached to the front of the engine. Also, the air cleaner was attached. An air cleaner assembly would be attached to the vehicle, not just an open carburetor or open carburetor with a hat. Some of them actually had those as well. Stock manifolds, not test headers as they were called back then, and full exhaust. That means that every T, every Y pipe, everything else from the engine through that pre-muffler pipe, basically your pipes all are basically from a stock cars, is how that engine is tested. And so you might ask, well, how much power is lost with that? Well, I'll give you another opportunity to take a look at it. I made a handy dandy spreadsheet, and this is going to be the easier one for you to see. That is, go ahead and give you another opportunity to pause there. I've got, right down here, I've got the SAE standards as well as gross and net horsepower for this, again, 1971 Cuda. So let's run through the engines and I'll give you an idea. We're basically going to be talking about the V8s because those are really the ones that you're worried about. So one thing I want you to notice is the difference in percentages. And that's going to be the key point here. So if you option that car with a 318 in 1971, the gross horsepower rating for your 8.6 to 1 318 would have been 230 horsepower. Not too bad, right? Net horsepower, and again, this is J607 is the standard that we're talking about here, the most generous SAE standard, I might add. If you were to adjust it to SAE standard, it would go from 230 horsepower to 155 horsepower. A difference of 33% and a power loss of 75 horsepower. Now, contrast that with the 340 4-barrel, rated at 275 gross horsepower. Net horsepower is 235. Had a 10.3 to 1 compression ratio, horsepower difference of 40 horsepower, but only a 15% drop. Now you might ask yourself, why is that? Well, you remember that the 318 was tested with no air cleaner. The 318s had a more restrictive air cleaner assembly. It's quiet. It had a single exhaust, and where the 340 had a dual exhaust. So again, an area where the exhaust system absolutely played a significant role. As a matter of fact, the 2-barrel cars in this chart here, again, I'll put that back up so you can see it. The 2-barrel cars suffered the worst losses. The 318 suffered a loss of 33%. The 383 suffered a loss of 31% for an average of 32%. Main reason being, number one, obviously more restrictive air cleaner. Number two, significantly more restrictive exhaust system. All of that basically came together to give those parasitic losses a net result of being literally twice as restrictive as the less restrictive air intake systems and the dual exhaust. So that trend continues along the way. And to give you an idea, the average loss over all different engine types, whether it's 2-barrel, 4-barrel, multiple carburetor setups like the 6-pack or the Hemi. By the way, the Hemi was net rated, and we're going to get to that here in just a second. The average was 21%. Oddly enough, though, the average of the 2-barrel cars, which all had single exhaust, was 32%. difference between gross horsepower and net horsepower. But the 4-barrel cars, the higher performance cars, as well as the high performance cars, not just the higher, but the high performance cars, again, the 6-pack and the Hemi, both had a difference of roughly 16%. So again, literally half of the parasitic, or should I say not parasitic, but it is parasitic loss in some respects, but the power difference between net and gross. So if you're to go back and take a look at any of the engines, and by the way, I was playing around with numbers. These figures hold true for any of the engines that were rated back then. 2 barrels with a single exhaust lost 30% of their power just like that. All of the higher performance, basically the 4-barrel cars that had dual exhaust, all lost about 15%. Variants in between would just kind of fall in the middle, but single exhaust was typically the killer. And a lot of that also had to do with the fact that some of those intakes were just very restrictive intakes. And really it's the air cleaner assembly more than anything else. So let's talk about the bad boys. Let's talk about the 440 and the 426 Hemi. Because realistically, actually let's talk about 3. We're going to talk about the 383 4-barrel, the 440 6-pack, and the 426 dual quad Hemi, street Hemi. So to give you an idea, the 383 4-barrel for 1971, I know there were some other variants, but the 383 for 1971 was rated at 300 horsepower. Again, here's that list so you can see it again. I just want to make sure y'all are seeing this, so give you an opportunity to stop, screenshot it, and then you can have that on in the background you can look at that and have me on in the background as we're talking about this. Rated at 300 horsepower, net power was 250. Starting to sound a little bit familiar, and that's why I was saying the 300 horse 350s were also rated at 250 when their net numbers were released. 446 pack though. Let's talk about the ones that we actually want to talk about, right? Rated at 385 horsepower from the factory, gross horsepower. Net horsepower, by the way, this is net J607. I also did the calculations for how we measure power today. We'll get to that here in just a second. But J607 net rating of 330 horsepower. Keep in mind, this is a legendary engine from back in the day, and it's only rated at 330 horsepower. The Hemi, rated at 425 horsepower. And by the way, that is a legit number. I know that some guys have gotten a little bit more out of them. Look, all I can tell you is this. The gross power numbers have been exaggerated. There's a lot of legend going around behind this, but I can tell you that I've dynoed 440 cars. I've dynoed Hemi cars. I've driven them. They run good. They're torquey. That 440 cars are. The Hemi, they come alive at about 3,500 RPM. The stock ones do. But anyway, rated at 425, which is pretty legit. I know a lot of old timers don't want to hear that, but it's real. Okay. Net horsepower, J607 net, 350 horsepower. That's right. That legendary Hemi that everybody talks about, the street Hemi, was only making a net number of 350 horsepower. Now, how would those engines fare today? Well, you have to go back and you have to start now picking apart the J607 versus 1349 versus 1995 numbers. So before I get into that and start talking about where they fall in today, let me catch up with you guys and then we'll get back into this. Brent's asking, do you know if a ProCharger 6.4 can outrun a 6.2? Yeah, right into the shop again to replace parts on the 6.4 when it grenades itself. BB78 saying, what up, Professor? Got the arm flex. I like it. Always appreciate your help. Quick question. Where can I order those PSI 1516 valve springs? And do you recommend steel or titanium retainers? And y'all smash the like. You can go either way with that setup, steel or titanium. The RPM that you're playing with, you're not really going to see that much of a benefit with titanium, but you can get them from MMX. So Modern Mopar Extreme is where you find the PSI 1516 springs. Dr. Div saying that's how manufacturers cheated the numbers back in the day. Kind of, yes. That's in a way, that is how they did do a lot of the cheating on the numbers. Is what they would do is they would take a horsepower number at a lower RPM, which was legit. The Hemi was rated, I think the Hemi was rated at 5,000 RPM, but it would spin to 6,200. They would make or they would say that it would make peak power at a number that was lower, that made it look like it wasn't this high winding quote unquote race engine. So there were a few different ways. There were some that were flat out just underrated, which would be the L88 427. That engine was a legit 500 plus horsepower engine, but it was always rated like 430 horsepower, 435. It was always a weird rating in there for that one. White Knuckle, thank you very much. Saying little contribution to the cause, Bri. Thank you so much. And it didn't pop up on my thing, man. I would have grabbed it early, but thank you very much, man. I appreciate that. Very much for the cause. Thank you, sir. Arthur saying, what up, B? I'm listening. Nice. Thank you, Arthur. Sam Gray was saying, I always like dual quads. They look sexy. They don't make as good a power. They're not as efficient as a single, but they do look good. And if you tune them right, actually, I take it back. If you have like a pair of very small dual quads, they actually can be snappy and they'll work pretty well. Getting the linkage to work all together is a pain. Plus, under partial throttle, they can have some slight issues with distribution unless you Siamese the carburetors. You can do that, but there's a lot of trickery that you have to do to get them to act right. So, Sam saying 300 horsepower back in the 70s hits different than 300 horsepower today. That's true, and that's why we're kind of getting to this. Arthur Wall saying 446 pack. Yep. Dr. Div saying at White Knuckle RT, thank you, straight from the professor's brain. It will do well for what he's doing. Absolutely. Thank you much, man. Sam saying the race Hemi was a different animal than the street Hemi. That's 100% correct. And to be fair, it was originally called the Super Commando Hemi in 1964. I actually have the book on that engine. Arthur Wall saying old 300 horsepower definitely hit different. Absolutely, it did. At Doc Div saying cool, can't wait to see it run. Yep. And then Doc Div saying hopefully we can get him into the 10s. Would be nice anyway. That trans is going to help him. Sweet. So getting back to it, and you're exactly right. 300 horsepower did hit differently. And let's talk about the reasons for that. Most of that has to do with the fact that that 300 horsepower was achieved before 5,000 RPM. The perfect example I will always give for this is the 440. The 440 was rated, the single four barrel 440 was rated at 375 horsepower at 4,700 RPM. And this is something that was not rare for engines back then. In fact, it was more than norm. Most engines realistically signed off around 5,000 RPM. Very few, and this is like just the way that it was back then, but very few would spin over 5,000 RPM. Engines that would be, of course, the Side-Oiler 427, which was a beast, the L88 427, another monster, the 426 Hemi, which with a little massaging headers and things like that, of course, those would have to have the same things, but would do the same. But you just had very few. You had, the 340 would spin that high. You had a couple of 350s, a 327, a couple of 302s that would get to those RPMs. But the reality is that even those engines were signing off at around 5,500 to 6,000 RPM. And what that means is you had a lot more torque down low to play with. Lots of velocity through the intake manifold, lots of cylinder fill, regardless of the size of the chamber. they still made really good power. A good example of that is Foxy, or let me give to you Exhibit A back here. It's funny how always Exhibit A, the Camaro, isn't it? But it's a great example of old school technology doing things a little bit different, not necessarily worse, not necessarily better, just different. So the big deal is port velocity and cylinder fill, as opposed to outright flow and horsepower, big RPM. The Camaro that's sitting next to me is a 92 Gen 3 305 throttle body injected engine. And before you go, wow, it's slow. Yeah, it's kind of slow, kind of real slow. But here's the thing, incredibly torquey, very sharp underfoot, very snappy throttle response. That is the difference between the old school SBC engine, and keep in mind, this is the smallest, most anemic version of that, and the newer, like an LS platform, for example, or my LT1 that I had in my 94 Corvette. Same idea. That engine wouldn't spin over 5,500 RPM, but it was roughly 330 horsepower. And if you put that engine on a dyno next to any of the legends back in the day, it was actually making the same or more power than some of the more powerful small blocks back then. And again, but in saying that, nowhere near the power of an LS6, which is the 300 and let's call it a 350 version of the LS. I know it's 345, but you get the idea. It's, or 347, I should say. It's but it's still basically the same displacement. It just makes power in a completely different way. And the cool thing with these engines and engines back then was tip-in torque, tip-in throttle response. Exhibit A over here has that in bushels. You just barely tip into it, and it kind of pushes you back a little bit. Now, after that initial hit, it just kind of stays there. You know, it's not really pulling hard, but that's not the idea behind those engines. It's not the idea behind that engine. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about this. Yes, they, just like you said, they did hit a little bit differently, but they just didn't rev out. It was a case of what you have right now is all you're going to get. So yeah, the power delivery is different, but it doesn't remove the fact that by today's standards, that horsepower is still eerily low. You wouldn't hear of anything nowadays being legendary, and you wouldn't build a brand around the name of an engine that made, well, as low of horsepower as the Hemi does by today's standard. So let's get into the differences. Well, before I get into the differences, let me say what's up to everybody. I want to get too far behind. White Knuckles saying, that's what I was thinking. Tens, oh yeah, and then trans looks pretty. Too bad you'll never see it. Sam saying it was more diesel-like. That's kind of the idea behind it. Doc Div saying, love the old Gen 3, light the tires of whenever. Yep, that's the fun thing about that car is it's just so torquey down low. Shivney saying, my 392 half shaft got a small puncture in the boot next to the diff. Can I just rebuild it with a new boot and grease or just buy a new half shaft? I think you can rebuild those. I don't see any reason why you couldn't. If it's just something small, you know, you should be able to rebuild it. Sam saying old slow cars are more fun than new fast cars. Old slow cars put me in a good mood. I just get super chill, something that'll, you know, make smoke come off the tires when I want it to, but nothing too crazy, you know, just something fun, sounds good, and cruises well. This Camaro, what's funny about this Camaro is it'll squall the tires just fine, but it won't carry a burnout. But if I brake stand the thing, it'll smoke the tires, and that's really all I care about. But man, it will cruise. It will cruise at 80, 90 miles an hour effortlessly, just down the road. It's just neat. You tip into the torque, tip into the throttle, you get this instant hit of torque, and it just ding. And again, in fact, you know, Sam had said it's more diesel-like. Actually, it's more diesel-like than diesels are today, because these things are instant torque hits, like an electric motor almost. But this car, the Camaro, there are throttle positions with this car where it feels torqueier than the Hellcat, which is, I know, weird to hear, but it's true. Arthur's saying, wow, that's crazy. My car hits 306 horsepower at 7,500. All power available at 4,700. Sounds like a diesel or turbo petrol engine. Those old V8s had to be a riot. They are a riot. In fact, I've got one. Dr. Diff is getting a Sierra squared away. That's a 400 cubic inch engine that would be, I mean, it would be at its wit's end to hit 4,500 RPM. And of course the 305s, I don't think spun to 5,000 RPM either. It's just a different way of going about things. It's all the power right now, and then it's over with. You shift. There is no waiting on it. That's kind of the fun part about it. And Dr. just saying his old Gen 3 IROC had a 350 with 305 heads, and damn, it was fun. Valve float for days. Nice. I love it. That's the one thing with the Chevys, or really any of the stock heads. You can't run a lot of spring pressure. You can't run a lot of lift, which means you're kind of limited on duration numbers and things like that. So, oh damn, hang on, just say I gotta plug this thing in. Forgot to plug in my charger. Hang on. All right, there we go. All right, so next, whoa, hey, this is a bit of a weird thing. Next, we're going to talk about the SAE correction numbers, because you have to have a basis when it comes to the correction. I don't know, the correction formats, or else you really won't have a place to come from. So SAE J607. J607 corrects to, and by the way, J607, whenever you see DynoJet numbers corrected to SAE, usually this is what it's correcting to. This is the most generous of the SAE correction factors. That's why when you see SAE numbers, you got to find out what SAE testing criteria that they're adjusting to, correcting to, I should say. J607 is 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 0% humidity, and 29.92 inches of mercury, or 101.3 kPa. The reason why that is important is because of that 60 degree number and that 29.92 kPa. That is basically the best case scenario for the engine. Cool air, high barometric pressure. In other words, the DA would be very, very low. That used to be a zeroed out, and that's an aviation standard, by the way. And that would be what you would set your altimeter to, would be based around that 60% and that kPa, or that barometric pressure. And a lot of folks were looking at that and they said, well, that might be a decent standard. But again, you remember power plant standards, right? That's what we were talking about before when they were doing the gross numbers. You know, it's a power plant. We can't control what that power plant goes into, but this is what that power plant is capable of. Well, it's going into a car, right? And so it's going into a car. We need to test it in as it's sitting in the car, but we also need to test it in atmospheric conditions that actually make sense. So in comes the new standard. And again, the standard would have been out in 1972. It's called SAE J1349. And that corrects to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, obviously, 0% humidity, but a barometric pressure of 29.34, which is basically it's 99 kPa. And so the difference between, in terms of power, is roughly 4%, give or take. And that's pretty much like it, you can see that across the board. Any engine that is SAE 607, there's always a lower number associated with it. There's one more, and this is the one that is the latest of the horsepower corrections. J1995. This is the certified version of the J1349, basically. And there's a few other SAE correction models, but this is a certified think of it as like a third-party certification almost. Even though SAE is a third party, this is like a certified version of that third party, where you have to have somebody from SAE available on site when this testing is taking place. 77 degrees, but it's adjusted to 29.53, so a slightly higher density altitude per se, yeah, actually technically lower, better KPA of 100, KPA 29.53. Boy, that was brutal to get out, wasn't it? Anyway, again, not that big of a difference in barometric pressure. You're still looking at about a 4% difference. So what does that translate to when we're talking about horsepower in the engines that matter, right? So again, looking at our chart, and this time we're going to look at that beigey looking color right there. And we're going to take a look at this and we're going to say, okay, so we have a 383 with a 4-barrel that was rated at 300 horsepower gross is now 240 horsepower by today's standard, as opposed to 250 horsepower with the old standard, the J607. Ramp that up to the 446 pack, 385 horse from the factory gross, 330 net J607, 317 is what it would be rated at by today's standard. Now think about that for a minute. Again, 440 cubic inches. It's got three, count them, three 2-barrel carburetors sitting on top of it. Legendary engine. Car's capable of, hammering the quarter mile, but by today's standard, even though torque would be high at like 470 odd foot-pounds of torque, 490 foot-pounds of torque, it would only be rated at 317 horsepower. Blows my mind, right? Last but not least, let's talk about the Hemi. Now, here's the funny thing. Nobody gets worked up more than a boomer on a mission about how legendary the Hemi was. And it was a 500 and ding-dang horsepower thing. My uncle had a ring-a-dang with a friggin' Hemi, and it would blow the doors off it. Yeah. Okay, we get it. Rated at 425 horsepower, 350 net horsepower. By the way, that's a difference of 75 horsepower. That's a lot. By today's standard, that engine would be would be rated at 336 horsepower. So let's roll the math back. The original 5.7 Hemi rated at 345 horsepower would have been rated 10 horsepower more than the 426, just in terms of horsepower by those standards. Now, keep in mind the older standard would have been out before that, and it had been rated at 350 horsepower on that net standard. So the original 5.7 Hemi Gen 3 would have only been rated at 5 horsepower less than the 426 Hemi, 426 Street Hemi. Now, I'm not even going to go down that path. I'm not saying that the 345 Hemi from, the original Gen 3 that was in the Ram trucks, that was as powerful as the 426. Far from it. The 426 made 490 pound-feet of torque, and that was real no matter how you measured it. And yeah, that would absolutely walk all over any small block making that kind of power. But I think that the point is made pretty clear here, where net horsepower numbers versus the gross horsepower numbers, it's a pretty stark difference. And if you wanted to have the conversation with somebody, the average power loss is around 20%. So, and I'll skip past the average, the total average of 24, because I put that in there just to say, look, you know, all engines, 6-cylinder, 2-barrel, 4-barrel, multi-carb, it didn't matter. If you averaged all of those out, that was 24%, and this thing's not, I don't think it is anyway, focusing. But the balance of those engines, the higher performance engines, the ones you're going to talk about, the ones that came with 4 barrels and dual exhaust, multiple carburetors and dual exhaust, which would also hint at the fact that they had a less restrictive intake system to begin with. Those cars are 20% less. So if you take that number, multiply it times 0.8, that'll give you roughly what that engine would be rated today in today's numbers. And to me, it was pretty shocking because, you know, when I first started looking into this, I was really surprised. And I first started getting into this, God, I was just a kid. I was trying to back math my grandfather's 88 Chevy pickup that made 210 horsepower. You know, how could I equate that to the muscle car era? You know, how could I equate that to something that I was somewhat familiar with, just in terms of concept more than anything else? And it really did. It came from, you know, just playing with the numbers, and that 350, 300 horse that was then rated at 250, it made it kind of easy to, again, back math the thing into, you know, where I could understand it. Basically, it just meant that that 350, instead of making 210, if it were rated at or by the same standard, would have been about a 250-ish horsepower 350. Again, something real torquey, not super powerful. It, you know, rev out to, you know, 4,500 RPM, 4,700 RPM, whatever, kind of like the engine that's in Sierra, but lots of tip-in torque, lots of grunt, just not a lot of, you know, you're not going to spin the thing to the sky because there's no reason to do so. But anyway, I wanted to bring that information to you guys. I always found that really fascinating, and I thought that, you know, all of us are all car guys, and, you know, we're used to hearing these figures from back in the day, you know, 425 horsepower, 450 horsepower, 375 horsepower, but we all know that it doesn't really translate into today's numbers. How can we translate that number into something that is a little bit easier to digest and understand by today's standard? And when we correct those engines to today's standard, back over here on this side of that chart, I made sure that I included that percentage loss as well. So you can see that, again, if you're talking about a performance engine, that was optioned with a 4-barrel carburetor and that dual exhaust, so the engine actually breathes. Even though it's net, it still needs to be able to breathe. Then in that case, it'll be about a 20% loss. Now then, if we're talking about a 2-barrel variant, again, a 318 or a 383 or a 350 or a 400 small block Chevrolet, something that came from the factory with a 2-barrel and a single exhaust, there's a lot of potential there to get some of that power back, because by today's standard, you know, you're looking at power loss, you know, in terms of rating. I mean, you're looking at anywhere from, like, for a 383 with a 2-barrel, had an 85 horsepower difference. I think that's the biggest difference in horsepower. It was the 383 with a 2-barrel went from 275 to 190. And again, a lot of that had to do with the fact that it had a silenced air cleaner. It had obviously more restrictive exhaust, different exhaust manifolds as well. So, you know, you find that engine. And by the way, I forgot to mention this earlier. Those 383s in 1971 were both 8.5 to 1 383s. In other words, the compression ratio was low. They were not the ultra high performance 10.25 or whatever 383s from back in the day. The 375 horse 383s, these were the lower compression 8.5 to 1. And the difference was 25 horsepower when they were rated as gross, 2-barrel to 4-barrel. So in a way, that's kind of the bonus info if you've not fallen asleep this far into the video. What's the difference between a 2-barrel and a 4-barrel 383, or at least a 2-barrel carburetor and a 4-barrel carburetor on an identical engine, well, if one of them's running a single exhaust with the 2-barrel, which most of them were, and well, it doesn't really matter because these are gross numbers, and this is actually where gross numbers can help you out. When you do the net numbers, there's a huge difference in power, but there's 25 horsepower difference between the two as they were rated. So that 4-barrel, worth about 25 horsepower on a low compression 383 cubic inch V8. Now, once you put the exhaust system on the car, the difference went from 25 horsepower to 60 horsepower difference in the net rating right there. So that tells you if you had a 2-barrel 383, if you just put dual exhaust and a 4-barrel on it, it'd wake it up quite a bit. It would get it back up to that 300 horse-ish level, but you'd pick up a lot of power in the process. Again, you know, not a whole lot separating those two low compression 383s. And that kind of carried forward with all the other manufacturers as well. So, you know, what's the difference between a 2-barrel, 4-barrel? Basically 20, 25 horsepower minimum. So let me catch up with you guys. Again, I hope that helps you guys out. You know, just looking at, again, looking at the older cars and trying to figure out where, and, you know, how do they fall in line with today's cars in terms of horsepower? They're basically, you take that number and take 20% out of it. Sam's, I hit 325 at 2,500. Nice diesel issue. Ruth saying, hey, y'all, Dr. Just saying, Sierra put me in a good mood today. She was nice to cruise with a working turbo 350. Absolutely. Truck always mellows me out. Ruben saying, checking in with Riff. Got the thumbs up. Arthur saying, SAE standards changed in 2007. There was a change, J1995. And actually the first engine that was tested, whatever year the LS7 was released, that was actually the very first engine to be tested under the J1995 standard, which actually kind of created some funky problems for folks because under the old system, there were some engines that tested better and some engines that tested worse under the 1995, the J1995 criteria. So not every engine picked up and not every engine lost. It was kind of a shotgun effect of how they did. But for the most part, it's a certified version of the 1370. I always get these numbers backwards. 1349. I don't know why I always say 1379. It's just some number that's stuck in my head. But anyway, but yeah, I think it was right around that time where that changed. But again, that is a voluntary. It's not mandatory. It's a voluntary SAE standard as opposed to the 1349 being the mandatory way to test those engines. Rick saying, after getting my Hellcat set up with the new E85 tune, I noticed that when I go to the black key mode, it has 0 boost. In fact, at full throttle, it's -2. Do you know what might be causing that? There is a, yeah, I do. There's a, oh hell. If I have my computer sitting with me, I could actually steer you into where this is. But there is a table under its engine torque management, driver command, and it's a black key table. And they may have made adjustments in the black key table, but it's basically a percentage of torque that it allows with the black key. It'll have the black key, it'll have valet mode, and it'll have, I think eco mode is in there also. But that's where you would look in those, I think if I remember correctly, that's gotta be where it's at. ECU, it's not the trans, it's ECU, torque management, driver command torque, black key, I think is where you'll find it. Brent saying, what is a safe red line setup for the 392? I don't see any reason to run it past about 6250, honestly. I didn't have any luck running it much past that. 63, yeah, probably pretty good there, but If you're running the stock cam in a stock intake, stock throttle body, you're just not going to flow much more after that. In fact, from your point of view, the power curve will come up and it'll start to carry over and then it'll drop. There's about a 400 RPM tabletop on that RPM, or on the top side of the RPM band, that it just, you're hemorrhaging torque. Whenever you tabletop horsepower, you are hemorrhaging torque. Now, if you tabletop torque, you're gaining horsepower. That's good. You tabletop horsepower, you're hemorrhaging torque, and at some point you're going to go past where your shift point is going to be picking up that nice big wave of torque. So you could probably run it out the back door. If you're going to change your shift points, run it out the back door in 4th gear or 5th gear, but not on 1, 2, 2, 3, and 3, 4. Let's see. Sam saying it's the same standard they use to test diesel, J2509. Yeah, I've only seen the 19, but there's a lot of different, the thing is that there's a lot of different SAE standards. So we're just going off of the kind of the heavy hitters of the SAE standards here. That's what they're pulling for those numbers. Ship's asking, why did you change your drag pack wheels? Weight, looks, offset. So I changed them for a couple of reasons. I do, and we'll be doing some testing for Hoosier, and it makes a lot more sense for me to run a set of wheels that has conical lug nuts. So there's that reason, number one. But I've got the Recluse for that. I was able to pick up a set of Recluse for next to nothing. And those are going to be the test wheels. I just wanted something to be a little bit more consistent, use the same lug nuts back and forth. The second reason why I got them is I just like the looks of them, man. I really like the look of the Forgestar. It's just a really sharp looking wheel. Plus, it's a 10-inch wide wheel. And I don't have them here. The reason why I wanted to run a 10-inch wide wheel is because on the 305 45 17 and the 28 10 5 17, the sidewall is a lot more flat. So you get a better footprint of the rubber on the road. The Dark Stars are a 9.5-inch wide wheel, which does fine. But if you notice on the wheel itself, you've got about a 1/2 inch of chicken strip on either side of that tire, which just kind of cracks me up. But anyway, with the wider wheel, I have a more consistent footprint. So there's that. The car seems to be a little bit more stable at high speeds. Not that it wasn't stable before. I mean, I'd spooled up the Race Stars to 150, 155, whatever I've spooled those things up to in Mexico. And I've had them over 160, 165 in some higher power cars, and they didn't really feel bad. I mean, it's just one of those things where the Forgestars look really good. And, well, they're a forged wheel. They're a little bit stronger. And again, I just really like the look of it. Looking to change her up a little bit, but primarily because they got the conical lug nuts, man. And they're easier to take on and off the car. And you don't tear them up in the process. That's the other thing. But if you decide to get them, make sure you get those hub-centric rings. Sam's hanging out with Rift. Let's see. Arthur was still very impressive. Arthur saying, what would the 1970 Chevelle SS454 be rated in SAE standard today? So the SS454 was rated at 450 horsepower. If you take 20% of 450, that's 90. So it'd be rated at basically 360 horsepower in today's numbers. Challenger 50 saying, I had a 70 Charger 446 pack in 1972. The horsepower was underrated with a 14 gear. That thing pulled hard. Well, I tell you what, the torque was probably underrated. The horsepower was what it was. I know that for the most part, most of the 440s were pretty decent performing engines. But right in that, give them some credit and say that they're Well, based on this 446 pack making 385 horse, when you go into the net power numbers, that's where, when you start to look at the J607s anyway, the power is pretty accurate. The torque, again, is really high, and I think that's where people get the biggest misconception. The torque is what sold those cars. What you have to remember is that people today, kids of all ages, by the way, not just them youngins, but, you know, folks today don't understand what it's like to drive a car with an engine that makes peak power, let's say at 5,000 RPM, realistically 4,700 RPM. But it makes all of the torque all of the time. There's no comparison to today. And so let me circle back into the topic here, guys. So, and one of the things that Challenger 50 brings up, it's a good point, and it bears its place. So when you're talking about an engine that makes, in this case, by today's standards, 330, 317 horse or whatever, but it makes all of this torque, 470 pound-feet of torque from tip-in, not at wide open throttle. These engines, what you have to remember is that they made all of their power all of the time. They were kind of light switchy in that respect. Where, again, I give to you example A over here, the Camaro. At half throttle, you have all the torque that car will ever make. At about a third throttle, you've got all the torque this car is going to make. It's just not breathing as well, right? At wide open throttle, you get all the torque it's ever going to make. You see where I'm going with this. The tip-in throttle response is what made the old school muscle cars so fun to drive. And again, say what you will about horsepower numbers, because I know that it's, you know, a lot of folks get worked up and, oh, this is underrated and that's underrated. Not in terms of horsepower, but the torque that they produced is underappreciated. And I think that's really what the point is. There's a lot of engines running around making 350 horsepower. In fact, a V8 that makes any less than 350 horsepower by today's standard, I don't even know. I'm sure there are some that exist, but there's not that many. But those are also high winding engines that don't make a lot of torque per their displacement at those low RPMs. The 440 is a completely different animal too, because the 440 has got a set of heads that are basically put together for very high velocity, very good cylinder fill, but never were really designed for high RPM. And the stat that I always like to quote here is that the 440's port velocity, regardless of the size of the port, the actual speed of the air that's moving through that port, the port velocity of a 440 at 4,700 RPM was the same as the 426 Hemi at, if I remember the number correctly, 6,200 RPM. Now, the Hemi obviously has much larger chambers, but it gives you an idea in terms of how the cylinder would fill at those RPM. The 440 had unbelievable cylinder fill at those lower RPM, which again lends itself pretty strongly to the, just the general census of the day that the 440 was the better engine of the two. It was always on. And where the Hemi, you had to wait, it was a little bit soft down low. Take out of the equation that if you lived in a cold area, they were horrible to start in the morning. Anyway, long story short, there wasn't a whole lot separating a 440 car from a Hemi car in terms of ET at the drag strip. Maybe 3 miles an hour, but 3 miles an hour is a lot. I mean, think about it at the drag strip. I mean, you're walking around somebody at 3 miles an hour, 4 miles an hour. But the local drags on the street, stoplight to stoplight, 440 is going to give that Hemi all it can handle and then some, because it gives you all of this power so early on. Makes it tough to argue, especially when you start to consider tires of the day and everything else. It just, the 440 is going to do some work where the 426 just couldn't. And I think that's really more to the point, is that, you know, a lot of folks misconstrue that real torquey feeling down low for horsepower, and it's just not really quite the same. Sam Grable saying, it makes me wonder what the race Hemi had in the 69-70 Daytonas and Bird. Oh, in terms of horsepower, they're about 650, 700 horsepower engines, easily in that range. But you're talking a completely different animal. And by the way, that would probably be a low performing variant of that. That'd be like a Bristol motor. The larger, like a true Daytona, Talladega type of a setup was probably close to 700 horsepower, if not more. Rip saying, I always heard that the 426 was a better engine than the 440. Don't know if that's true or not, though. The 440 was a better street motor than the Hemi anyway. Yeah, more torque. Well, lower power band, and all of that power was available about the time that the Hemi woke up. You were shifting the 440. So, you know, where the Hemi would come alive at, say, 3,500 or 4,000 RPM, the 440 is basically it's like, I'm done, shift. I got this whole wave of torque behind me that you're going to want to catch. And it was happening at 45 to 5,000 RPM. Whereas the Hemi, you know, I know it was rated at 5,000 RPM, but the reality is you would spin the thing to 65. And that's, again, like I was saying, that port velocity, you start comparing port velocities and you find out pretty quickly where the thing is going to be making power. Hemi was way on the big end of the spectrum. Now with the Hemi, you could gear it, and, you know, gear for gear, mile per hour, you could set it up, and with a set of 456s, that Hemi would sing. But, you know, you'd still have to do some work to it. But it didn't take much to get the Hemis to rip, and that's another thing, is that they would absolutely take to mods. You know, cam, headers, you know, intake, carburetor adjustments, timing changes, fuel changes. Yeah, now we're talking about a car that's making a lot more power. So that's another big difference too. Kana's saying the 426 was for high RPM running. Its rated was 425 at 5,000 when it can really rev to like 6,000. That's true, but the Hemi, from what I remember, the Hemi did start to tabletop pretty quickly. And a lot of that had to do with intake manifold design, also had to do with timing, camshaft profiles, things like that. But yes, no, it would definitely run to 62, 6,500. But I wouldn't necessarily do it with a street Hemi. Now, if I had like a day two hot rodding, like, you know, the shade tree version of this would be, instead of the hydraulic lifter cam, put a solid lifter cam in it, put a set of headers on it, a tune-up and everything else. And that's when the complexion of that engine completely changed. Except for one thing, and this is what guys have to remember. It is a Hemi engine with low compression, and low for a Hemi is about 10 to 1. And in fact, it was what, 10.2 to 1 in this case. That's not high enough for a Hemi to work properly. In all honesty, in my opinion, I would want to see 10.5 to 1. 11.5 to 1, at least 11 to 1. And there are plenty of cars back then that were doing that. I think the race Hemi was 12.5 to 1. And I'm of the opinion that 12.5 to 1 is a nice place to start if we're talking about racing in an NA car. I really want to see something more like 13, 14, 15 to 1 if you're going to be running race gas anyway. If you're going to be running street pump gas back then yeah, 12.5 to 1 will probably get you where you need to be. But that's really what it would have taken to get that thing to wake up, especially down low, and have a little bit better throttle response. Boosted saying I run the 4-star D5s on the front and rear on my Hellcat. I have bead locks to make sure the tire doesn't move. Actually, mine doesn't seem to be moving too much. I'll seat mine in. In fact, I need to take it out for another scoot. If it's not raining, I'll do that on Thursday. Get it out and see if I can see if I can get a little bit of air through her lungs there. Riff saying, Raystar rake loose wheels work good and do not need anything other than the stock lug nuts. That is very true. Riff is asking, do you think a slap shift transmission loses as much as an automatic to the wheels compared to a manual? Well, a slap stick or a slap shift is just a shifter on an automatic. That's one of the options for the Mopars, E-bodies and B-body Mopars. You can get the slap shift shifter. Now, if you're talking about a sequential where you're just pulling gears, no, that's going to be the same. That is a manual. It just has a different form of synchronizer in it. But no, a regular slap shift style shifter, all that is just a shifter for an automatic, and it allows you to shift it manually. Kind of a cool deal. Saying, yeah, that's what I mean. Oh, you're talking about the sequentials. Yeah, no, sequentials are identical to, I mean, they are a manual. There's no difference. In fact, there's also one that's called a Lenco style transmission where that has the levers and you shift it from the outside in. You still use a clutch, but it's first gear and then it's second to third, third to fourth, fourth to fifth. It's what the Pro Stock cars use. And every once in a while, you'll see somebody throw that in a street car. And the hell was that? Anyway, those are pretty trick. Those are pretty cool. Let's see. All right, that's at the bottom of the list. I was making sure I didn't miss anybody. And again, guys, I don't understand why the super chats aren't. I know we had one super chat in here. It didn't pop up. That was White Knuckle. And I don't know why that's not popping up here. That's weird. I know that I've been having, a lot of folks have actually been having some weird stuff going on with YouTube lately. I'm not sure what that's all about. I did have to update my YouTube too. And some of y'all have asked about, so there's been a couple of videos that I took down, but I didn't take them down because I wanted to. I took them down actually sort of by accident. A couple of the live shows. What had happened was I had updated YouTube, and when I updated YouTube, something happened. It was really weird. I can't really explain why or how this would be the thing or be the case, but it was acting like I was still trying to upload a video that was already uploaded on YouTube. So if you were sitting at your computer, you grabbed your phone and went to the channel and pulled up a video, you could see it. Well, on my end, it looked like it was still trying to in fact, it said processing. So I was looking at it going, okay, well, dude, something's weird. I don't know, some kind of something. So it said cancel upload. It's like, yeah, let me cancel it because it's already uploaded. Maybe it's just a weird glitch. And when I do that, or when I did that, it wiped out the entire video. So anyway, I know I had a couple of questions about that. I apologize for that. It's just kind of a goofy thing. So what I did was I removed all of the updates out of YouTube, and I'm just working off, I guess, an older YouTube that works fine. So Rift is asking, did you answer the question about the CVT trans? I didn't see a question about a CVT. Oh, here you go. Rift is asking, I guess I missed it. Asking, do you think that a CVT transmission will ever get better for racing? Actually, they're already really good for racing. So good, as a matter of fact, they got outlawed by F1. Yeah, I mean, it's basically a cone clutch. And so, yeah, it's just an engineering thing to get it to where it needs to be. Most people get a little bit weird with CVTs though. They want to feel the shift. It's just kind of a weird sensation. And what's also weird is that, obviously a lot of the CVTs are now being made to act like a regular transmission, which is so weird. I don't understand. Anyway, I like CVTs. In fact, I had, what was it? A Nissan Rogue. What the hell was that thing? anyway, whoever had it before me, was smoking a lot of weed in this rental car. I had a rental car in Georgia once, and it was a CVT, some Nissan thing with a CVT, and it was weird. If you were kind of in the throttle a little bit, it would just sit at like 4,000 RPM. And at first it was kind of weird, and then I was going, man, I kind of like it. This is kind of cool, So basically you just floor the thing wherever you wanted to go, and it was constantly making a bunch of noise. But anyway, I found some back roads. I was there for work, and anyway, this was my rental, and so at night, or after training, I would get in this thing and go grab something to eat, and then I'd go hit some back roads in this thing and just go explore the area that I was in. And yeah, it was pretty cool, because I was just matting the throttle and just all over the place, all over Dalton, Georgia. So anyway, yeah, I mean, they were outlawed at one point. I don't know if they'll ever circle back around to CVTs. There are some engineering things that they have to get around in terms of durability and power, just the power handling part of it. But I think that there was 1 year, maybe 2 years, where somebody had campaigned a CVT and it was deemed illegal, so they canceled it. I can't remember all the details on it though. Let's see. HU37 said it was harder to compete with the 426 Hemi because they were placed in higher classes as opposed to most stock factory cars. Not necessarily. I mean, you had the side-oiler 427. You have to remember that the Mark III big block, the 427s and the 454s and the 396s that you know and love, that canted, basically twisted wedge layout was put together to compete against the Hemi directly. It's just that, the Hemi did a better job of it, And the funny thing about it is the Hemi architecture is ancient. The Hemi, so real quickly, we've got a little bit of time here. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of Hemi versus a wedge head? That's always been kind of a funny conversation, because people hear Hemi and they have a weird concept of why it's good. They always say, well, the heads flow and they have valves look at each other. Not necessarily the reason. Hemis do really well in terms of volumetric efficiency. In other words, just simply getting air into a chamber. They offer an advantage because you can run a significantly larger intake valve, which reduces pumping losses. And the reason why that was important is because way back over 100 years ago, again, you'll hear me talk about the Hall Scott engines. These were power plant engines, power plant manufacturer that was making airplane engines at the time. And all of those engines were gear-driven, overhead cam, Hemi architecture. It sounds like something you'd hear in a race car, right? But no, this was over 100 years ago, and they did it like that because it was simple. In fact, back then, for this type of architecture, you would have never even dreamed of having a cam and block engine. It'd have been way too complicated when you can just stick the cam on top, have a bevel gear down at the crank, a bevel gear at the camshaft. They were shaft driven, and they just had followers, actuating valves, nothing to it. But those engines didn't rev very high. They revved to maybe 1,200 RPM, but they were 5-inch bore, 4.5 or 5-inch bore, 6-inch stroke, this huge engine, but it was just there to move air, and that was it. Very low compression because fuel quality was, you stare at the fuel and it would detonate. I think the octane rating was like 50 or something stupid like that, so they couldn't have a lot of compression. But the idea was to get as much air into the engine as possible and make it as easy to get air in as possible. But the catch is that and you didn't need it back then, they're fantastic in terms of volumetric efficiency, but not all that great in terms of thermal efficiency. In other words, transferring compression and ignition into actual power. That's where wedge heads come into play. Far more quench area. Whereas the Hemi's got the dome, and there's some scavenging issues with later engines where the dome of the piston, if you had a dome piston, yeah, some issues with scavenging, although I think that's a little more of a wives' tale than anything else. Just that hypothesis didn't play out in real life. But wedge motors do a great job of being very efficient in terms of translating flame front and pressure into cylinder travel. The flame fronts just don't have near as far to go. So in that respect, they're more efficient. That's why you get Hemis with dome pistons, and that creates funky forces on pistons and just a lot of weird things. But again, that's why you see an LS making crazy power and a Hemi both making crazy power. They do it in a couple of different ways. And again, the wedge head is just going to be a bit more thermally efficient, whereas the Hemi is more volumetrically efficient. Lower pumping losses is the big key with Hemis. Let's see. And Hemis are tumble port, which means they take big gulps of air and not a whole lot of velocity in performance applications, which is funny too, because my four-wheeler, which is a TRX 200, is also a Hemi. This is kind of funny. Low compression though. Brent saying, my trans tune on my 392 will get rubber going into fourth. Should I pull some power? I feel like I am losing mile per hour. No, just put a better tire on it. Sovereign Knight saying, Hebe Mason would have been on here earlier, but I just installed a new graphics card in the HTPC and enabling 4K HDR. Causes the screen to go black. Been fighting it for an hour. That's frustrating. Gordon saying, CVT trans reminds me of a go-kart torque converter setup. Yeah, the centrifugal clutches. They're actually, you're kind of basically about right. I mean, it's if you were to be able to take, well, that's exactly what it is. If you were able to take a, okay, so yeah, you remember the old, better than that, snowmobile clutches, and you'd see some of these on off-road go-karts too, where you have the centrifugal cone, and the faster the engine spins, the more the cone comes out, and the belt will ride up on the cone. That is a CVT transmission to a certain extent. It's just a single-sided CVT as opposed to a dual-sided. But same idea, same exact thing. Ripped is saying, I feel like the CVT would be able to keep boost up without losing it in between shifts. Yeah, I mean, it absolutely would. You would literally be in boost the entire time. Sovereign saying CVTs suck. The only thing is modern, they do now because they haven't put, they just don't have the development in them yet to be able to manage the type of power. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, Frostbite saying he's dropping let's see, some racing built 46 reverse manual valve body and with trans brake in my Ram. Surprisingly, I haven't killed my 545 running mid 11s consistently. Well, shocked that thing's holding together. But yeah, some guys have good luck with them. Let's see. Riv saying, talking about the transmission suck, but yeah, a lot of it has to do with the cars that they're in. But again, they just don't have them put together to be able to manage that type of power. White Knuckles checking in with Frostbite. Let's see. White Knuckles saying, Dr. Diff and I were talking about your truck earlier. Very nice. Yeah. Y'all Sierra. Love that truck. Sovereign saying, why change the formula if it works good? I hear that. White Knuckle. No, it didn't. Saying, did it pop up this time? No. As a matter of fact, I was just kind of scrolling through real quick just then. It hadn't popped up. So I don't know what the deal is with those. Weird. Normally you would see it right along up here. It would pop up as a super chat. Or for you guys, actually, it might be popping up down here. I don't know. That's so weird. I don't know why it's not coming up on my end. White Knuckles checking in. Let's see. Frostbite saying, hopefully the new transmission and Enforcer cam will get us to deep 11s or into the 10s. Oh, yeah. It will. No doubt. Oh, White Knuckles checking in. Let's see. Riff saying, why don't they make more 4-valve V8s? Is it only good on overhead cam V8s? So one of the reasons why you don't see more 4-cam V8s is packaging. Although Ford seems to do a pretty good job packaging theirs, and everybody else seems to do a pretty decent job packaging theirs as well, the more mainstream engines are going to be 2-valve. And a lot of that has to do with cost, although there's not a huge difference. I think at this stage of the game, if you have already invested in the technology of being able to assemble the 4-cam motors, but the reality is that it's cost and packaging. They are simply just more expensive to put together, and they're more expensive, or they're more time consuming to put together, which is expense, and they're also more expensive to put together because you got 4 cams to deal with. But again, that goes back to time. I think realistically, you could probably, with economies of scale, you could probably get it within, I would say, 15%. But again, you're adding 15% to the cost of an engine, which is already a pretty expensive part of the car. So most engineers will tell you that it's a packaging issue, though. It's just a whole lot easier to package a 2-valve V8 than it is a 4-valve, because that 4-valve head is like this freaking wide. I mean, they're huge if you ever see one, and it has considerable height to the engine as well. But again, the Mustang seems to be doing pretty well and not having any problems. Hey, it just popped up. Hold on a second. Let me see something. Brian's checking in. So with Brian's super chat, that did pop up and it populated all of the super chats. So that's weird. I don't know why it's doing that. Brian G's asking, is milling down the heads to bump the compression ratio an option on Gen 3 Hemis? To a certain extent it is. You could probably get away with, say 20 thousandths, I think would be the max before, because you have to remember that in any normal V8, so let's say if your intake runners are, basically on your same 45, as you mill the heads, the normal ports would go down. Well, at Gen 3, they're up top. And so when you mill the heads, those ports come in slightly. And I think 20 thousandths will get you where you need to be. Basically a cleanup. Like if you deck the heads, those would probably be okay. I wouldn't try to go in and mill them specifically to bump compression. But any compression that you do get by milling them would definitely help. I'd say you could probably get, a couple of tenths of a point out of them, but not by too much. But thank you very much for the super chat. Oh, and by the way, Brian, I would probably suggest pistons. If you're going to have the engine apart that deep, I'd say go ahead and just pull it, run a little bit higher compression piston in it, and do a cleanup just deck the heads, and you'll be in a lot better shape. That way you can control ring gap at that point. So I would say if that's the case for the top 2 rings, I would probably I'd still kind of keep them a little bit loose, even with low tension rings. If you're going to keep it NA or boosted, it really wouldn't matter. I'd probably go like 20. I'd say if you're keeping it NA, go like 22 thousandths on your top ring, 24 thousandths on the second ring. If you're going to go boosted, I'd probably go 26, 27 thousandths on the top ring and about the same on the second ring. Let's see. I missed a couple of people because White Knuckle jumped in. Let's see with the super chat. Thank you, brother. Let's see. Let me catch up with you guys real quick. Okay. Damn, what happened to me here? Okay, here we go. Rift saying a CVT trans reminds me of those bikes where you pedal it, and it changes gears by itself depending on how fast you go. I know, right? White Knuckle saying, grab a 6-pack of Coke Zero on me, Brad. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Absolutely. Rocking the Pepsis this evening. All the same, though. Let's see. Shift Nation saying we can see it. What did I miss? What did I miss? Shift Nation, what did I miss? Trying to update, second time's the charm. Oh, Jamie's asking, if the HP90 is so stout, why do some people swap to a Turbo 400? Well, the HP90 is very stout. There's a lot of folks that have gone, well, the fastest Hellcat with an HP90 has gone 815 at like 170 miles an hour. That would be Z. Brian Sanders' car went 830s, 840s at 167 miles an hour. So they will definitely get there with an HP90. But the reason why folks will go with a Turbo 400, there's a few reasons. One, it's lighter. Second reason, you can custom build a Turbo 400 with whatever gear ratios you want. Thirdly, they're cheap. If you explode one, there's kind of that hidden little gem in there as well. They're easy to work on, and the reality is that you've got more options with torque converters as well. In general, it's just a hell of a good drag race transmission. I think the bigger question here is, why do people go with Turbo 400s when a 727 torque flight will bolt right to the back of that engine with no spacer, no anything? Or it should, at least, because my understanding is the bolt pattern is identical. 727 is also a beast of a transmission. So, but that's the reason why. And you can build a Turbo 400 to handle, a unlimited amount of power, basically. Whatever, you'll crack the case in some cases before you'll hurt the internals on that Turbo 400. Frostbite, thank you very much. And Rift saying, just to thank you for all the info. I'll have my tuner check out why I have no boost in black key mode. Don't want to change too much myself. It's something you can go in there and take a look at, brother. It's not that big of a deal. If you see something weird in there, just do a compare file with your stock tune. See if anything was changed in there. There shouldn't be anything changed in there, and most guys don't. I know like Racer X's car runs fine in 500 horse mode. So I don't know. Can't really tell you why. But that's typically the difference of just the percentage of torque that it allows it to pump out. And Frostbite Rams checking in, saying, new subscriber here, Dr. Div sent me. Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Div. Say, I have a pretty large Mopar channel. I will definitely give your channel a shout. Go to support the Mopar channel, or got to support the Mopar channels. Well, thank you very much, man. I appreciate that. We'll have to check you out as well. Do the live show. Let's see. We typically do the live show twice a week, Tuesdays and Saturdays. So thank you for hanging out, man. I appreciate it. We'll definitely give the channel a look. I see truck at drag strip. I click yes. I love it. Let's see. Where did I go? What happened to me here? Street Fox saying 347 saying, hey, Mason, what's up, Street Fox? Rift saying, Rift is asking, is the Mustang so cheaply built inside because it is a overhead cam engine? No, that's just the way the Mustangs are. Actually, it depends on what level trim you go with. The Mustangs can actually be pretty nice. I would say that the Mustangs are very efficient with how they use the interior space, though. And again, Rift and Frostbite, thank you all very much, man. I appreciate that, guys. And yeah, again, Rift, it's I don't know. It's kind of weird if it's producing zero boost. I would definitely take a look at that because I like playing with my car in 500 horse mode, to be honest with you. Street Fox is asking, what octane do you recommend for a 10.901 compression and AFR 205 race heads? Depends on how you have the car set up. Depends on what you're doing with it. But I would say that you could scoot around with it on 93 octane, but I would probably recommend either G, because 10.9 is really not that high. I don't know what intake you're running, But I would say that 93 octane will get you there. But if you really want to get the most out of it, go with Sunoco 260 GT or 260 GT Plus or VP's MS109. In that case, you can crank up the timing and again get a little bit more power out of it. But again, you're not really breaking the bank here in terms of the 10.9. The AFR 205 heads are really good heads. They're going to flow their asses off. So obviously you're going to be turning some pretty significant RPM with that 347 if you're running those heads. And I'm guessing you've got a single plane on it. If you've got a dual plane on it, probably a little bit too much head for that combination. But again, you'd still be good with like 100 octane. No problem. Good heads though. I love my AFR heads. Challenger is saying, I ruined several Turbo 400s, but I never lost a 727 trans. Maybe I was lucky. I've never, to be honest with you, I know of quite a few 400s that have failed, but 727s are always pretty rock solid. So, and yeah, Rip saying I'll check out Frostbite for sure. Check him out. Rip saying, yeah, for sure it's zero boost. Yeah, I would take a look at that. And again, it's going to be hidden in that black key table. Oh, White Knuckles. Yeah, White Knuckles saying he's on Frostbite's channel. Very nice. Saying it's come a long way. Thank you, sir. I like it a lot. Cool. Well, guys, hopefully y'all enjoyed the topic tonight. I know this has just kind of been a pet topic that I've had for a while. Wanted to dive into these gross versus net horsepower numbers because, again, you know, we get a lot of folks that have had these cars from back in the day, and you know it's hard to put them into perspective, really. You know, and these are figures for the 1971 Barracuda / Cuda engine offerings, right? So we're talking about a lighter weight car here. We're talking about basically practically every engine it looks like that was available in 1971 you could put into that car too, by the way. Anything from 198 cubic inch 6-cylinder, and then you had the Tower of Power, the 225. That's what everybody basically grew up winding until it exploded. But still kind of crazy that was a 145 cubic or 145 horsepower engine. Anyway, I just get a kick out of that. I think that was the engine that was in that truck that my grandfather had me. Got to control the skid. Anyway, but yeah, we had a lot of engines that we went over. But again, the interesting thing is the shorthand of it is if you wanted to get an idea for the percentage of power, horsepower, you just take that number, multiply it times 0.8, and that'll give you a really good indication of where those engines are. Let's see. Riff saying, oh, thank you, man. Saying, always enjoy the topics you talk about. Very informative. Thanks, man. I'll try to be informative. That's the main thing. Let's see. Oh, and Frostbite saying we were going to do the 727, but went with the 46 RE for overdrive. Understand that completely. That's like Sierra. You know, it's funny. That thing, a little bit on the fence, man. I was, at some point, it may get a 700 R4 conversion, but it is going to stay small block Chevy. I think I'm just going to keep it that way because that instant torque, that instant just wave, that instant throttle response is just so addictive. And I know that, you know, an LS swap makes more sense nowadays, but I don't know. I could probably be convinced that it's the smartest play for that truck, but I don't know, man. I just like to have a little bit of nostalgia, you know. It's not a daily, so why not? Oh, Rift is saying, I guess I found your channel a long time ago, talking to Frostbite. White Knuckles saying, great show, bro. I hope to see you Saturday. Have a good night all. You do the same. Thanks for hanging out. I may do a track chat live on Friday. It's going to depend on how everything kind of shakes loose, but I am hoping to be at the drag strip on Friday. I need to get some data on Little Miss Revlon with this latest tune revision that I did. And again, this is actually me not being a little bit less aggressive with a couple of things with the car, but I'm interested to see what she runs. I'd like to be able to cover another 20 or a teen, but if the DA is going to be like in the 0-ish range, if it can do that, then I will be a happy camper. But based on what I was seeing in the data, she's looking pretty good. So White Knuckle saying, I am out. Good seeing you, White Knuckle Man. Thank you very much. Shift Nation is asking, you or Dr. Diff have any feedback on the intake manifolds, Holley Sniper versus Victor 2 on a 392? So here's the thing. The Sniper's out of the question. I wouldn't even waste my time with that thing. It's a very short runner. And the 392 in that heavy of a car, you're not going to get anything out of that short runner. I mean, unless you re-gear it. And really, it doesn't have the cam profile to accommodate a short runner. It'll drag power out on the big end with that cam, but I just, you're going to have to spin that thing to about 7,000, 7,200 RPM to really get the most out of it, which means you need valve springs and you're going to need push rods at least. Once you start getting past about 7,000 RPM with those things, things aren't going to necessarily end well in some cases if you don't make some upgrades. The Edelbrock, on the other hand, I've got mixed emotions with that intake manifold because from what I've seen, and keep in mind that my experience with that intake is limited only to the stroker motors, but on the 426s, they seem to do okay. What I will caution you on is running that intake on a 392. I can see where it would possibly do better through the mid-range. And what I mean by mid-range, I mean from 3,800 RPM to 5,500 RPM. I think that you would see a gain there only because that is where the 392 intake is making the crossover from long runner to short runner. The factory pivot RPM is 4,700 RPM. And so when you're right around that area, that's where the fixed runner length of that Edelbrock actually, I think, will do a little bit better. It's got a little bit bigger cross section also. But what I've seen of them is that they don't carry power as well out the back end and they don't build as much torque down low, but they've got maybe some more power and more torque through the mid-range. I don't, again, have any experience with them on a 392, only on the 426s. And they do fine on the 426. They build power all the way across the RPM range. They don't really give anything up, but we also haven't been running 392 intakes on very many 426s. And in fact, that's one of the big regrets that I have. Before I left the shop, I never took one of the 426s and ran a 392 intake on it, or I never took a 392 and went back-to-back intake manifold testing. We just never really had the time. Most of the time, the intakes were there. I could have used them. We just didn't really have the time. And you have to understand, when you're working in a busy shop, that dyno is always turning. And I had very little downtime to where I could actually test a lot of that. That's why when I was doing the dyno chats, a lot of that was stuff that I did at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was just tests that I had run when there was absolutely nobody at the shop, or I had, like with Quick Brick's car, Racer X's buddy with that real pretty white Charger with the white stripes. Just doing timing testing, test or pallet pull after pull after pull, on the E85, trying to get that thing to like timing. And there was at one point that car just was hating life in terms of, or hating timing, I should say. It was weird. You'd think it had picked up a lot, but it didn't. But yeah, that is one of the tests that I really wish I could have done. And, it just never actually happened. But from what I've seen, again, the Sniper not going to do you a whole lot of favors unless you have to build an engine around that intake manifold, meaning that you are in it to win it. You're going to spin this thing to 7,500 RPM. You're going to run 120 push rods, PSI 15, 16 springs, lots of camshaft, lots of compression, mind you. We're talking a minimum of 12.5 to 13 to 1 compression, 2-inch long tube headers, and you're building a race engine, NA, by the way. And this could also pertain all of those plus stroker as well. So definitely not for the faint of heart, but there at least is a manifold out there for you should you choose to go that route. CJ's checking, what's up, B? What's going on? Everything's good, brother. Riff saying, love the live vids. Brent's checking out, saying, later, guys. Have a good night. You have a good night too, buddy. Frostbite saying, I'm wanting that new Hiram Holley manifold for my truck. Probably a better way to go. Yeah, the other ones I've seen just... The runner length is just too short. And the problem with the Hemi is that it is a tumble port. There's not a lot of velocity going through that head. And so when you try to turn the wick on them or try to put a manifold on them with a short runner, you've got to turn the wick really high up on those things. You've got to be in it to win it and know that if you're not building an engine that's going to be able to spin to 772, 7,400 RPM, you just will not be taking advantage of those types of intakes. That's just what I've seen anyway. Jamie saying, when are we going to see the 3rd gen up close? I don't know, maybe when it's clean. There's really not much to see, but I'll tell you what, I'll do a video on the 3rd gen soon. In fact, the 3rd gen is next on the list to get over to dock differential. The rear end's actually leaking in that thing, making kind of a mess of everything, but it's clean. It's a real clean car, but I do need to do that soon. I'll take y'all on a tour of it at some point. She's got a little ouchie on her hip too over here where somebody bumped into her. And of course it's right at the spot, right by where the spare tire is. Hang on, right there. And anyway, there's a bar that goes across right here. Actually, it goes that way or this way, right here, up and down. I can't use my fingers here. And there's no way to get anything behind it. You actually have to cut the spare tire bar out. But I don't feel like doing that. So, but anyway, there she is. Love that car. Cool car. What happened here? Frostbite saying, what's up, Modern? Oh, Modern Hemi's checking in. Modern Red saying, not much. Frostbite saying the car's getting fast. I like it. Shawnee's saying, hello, goodbye, good night, everybody. What's up, Sean? Have a good one, brother. White Knuckles got the thumbs up. Sweet. What's this thing doing? All right, guys. Well, I'll tell you what, we are coming up on almost 2 hours. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up, and then I got to get some shut-eye. But I want to thank each and every one of y'all for hanging out with me. Love each and every one of y'all. Could not do this without you. Hope you enjoyed the topic. I know a little bit off the beaten path, but it was fun for me because it gave me an opportunity to nerd out a little bit with an Excel spreadsheet, which is always good in my opinion. Hopefully it brought a little bit of perspective for you guys for these older vehicles. Always neat. The horsepower, the story is not in the horsepower, and that's really the big takeaway. There's a lot more to the driving experience than just a horsepower number. This is part of the more of an illustrative process or illustrative, point of that is that, yeah, these cars didn't make a ton of horsepower by today's standards, but they did make a ton of torque. And the driving experience, if you never have an opportunity, or if you ever get an opportunity to drive one of these old school big block cars, It's a driving experience, the likes of which you'll never have ever again. There's nothing that makes power like a big gas-powered V8. So anyway, wanted to bring that info to you. Thought it'd be kind of cool. I know it was for me anyway. I really enjoyed it. So at any rate, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Again, love each and every one of y'all. Could not do this without you. If you're going to send it, don't bend it. Keep your shiny side up. Keep wearing your mask. If not for yourself, then for others. And with that, it is a wrap. Y'all have a great week, and I look forward to seeing y'all on the next one. That's a wrap. Adios.